Those of you who've been following this, we've had the wheels restored. They're powder coated, have new tires mounted and balanced. And before we put those back on the car, I thought this would be a good time to replace the shock absorbers. Today we're going to be replacing the rear shocks. We're looking at the left rear wheel well. You can see the frame here and the hub and the rear spring. The wood blocks just for safety in case something comes down. Here is the old shock from the right rear, and we're going to be replacing with Monroe OESpectrum. This is not sponsored in any way, but that's what I chose to put. First thing we're going to do here is use this Daytona floor jack to lift up and support the rear axle for this side that we're going to be working on. I have another video, I'll put a link in the description below for the setup and bleed at the Daytona floor jack. So let's get started. So we're going to lift up the axle here just a little bit, and you can see there it's supported. With that axle properly supported now and the wood blocks underneath, we're going to climb up underneath here and take a look. Here's a view now looking from behind the rear differential and up towards the front of the left side of the car at an angle. And you can see back here, there's the shock absorber. And I'm showing you this angle because you can see here at the top, there's a gap. There's this plate here above the frame and below the body. There are two nuts on the top of this plate that we're going to have to access on the top and then also on the bottom in order to release the plate that's holding this upper part of the shock. Okay, here's a view up on top. You can see above the plate here one of those bolts or nuts, and that's the top part of what we have to access. It's a very awkward angle to get to. I've got a 1/2 inch socket here with a few extenders that run just slightly more than the length of the shock. And so that's the size that I have here for the bottom bolt or nut. On the top, however, it's a 10 millimeter. Now I've reached up and above here with a crescent wrench, and I've got it in place on the upper side here. And so I'm going to do the back one first, which you can't see from that camera angle, just because that is the hardest one and the most difficult to reach. And I'm going to reach up and behind and grab that crescent wrench just to make sure I got it where I need it to be. All right, here's a look up from directly below. And just a point here, we finally got this nut off right there. And this was the pain, the real tough one, because you had to reach up and above this plate from behind and then come up on this side with the socket and hold it in place on top so that you could loosen this one up. So now we'll come around and we'll do the front one, but this one is the hard one. Okay, now we're holding from above and we're just loosening up the nut here from below. Okay, there we are looking up at the top of the shock from below, and you can see we've got both of the nuts off, and up here those bolts will come out. I'll pull them out. These are the nuts from the bottom of the upper mounts for the shocks, and what a pain these were to get off. Either swollen or used many times or partially stripped, but long story short, 13 millimeter, those fit. 1/2 inch doesn't fit. All right, here's the nut bolt combo from the upper mounts, and this was a huge pain, but the upper was the 10 millimeter socket that you had to reach around and grab. So I'm going to replace these when I put it back together here with another set, stainless steel. These are 5/16 inch 18 coarse thread, and this is what I'll put in when I attach the new shocks. So this is the bottom mount for the shock. The nut here, of all things, 19 millimeter. Go figure. In the back, the bolt head has two flat surfaces. I'm going to grab onto those with a wrench so that they don't turn as I try to loosen this. Got the wrench gripping in the back, and I have the socket here in the front, and we're going to try to loosen this up. Just give it a couple of pushes here. So if you can't get it with the regular socket, you try a breaker bar, give yourself some more leverage, and just give that a good turn. And that'll eventually loosen up like that. And then we'll go back to the socket. Now as it loosens, we're going to still have to hold this in the back. I'll take the rest of it off here by hand. Lock washer behind it. Put those to the side. And now from here, we can slide out this way. Pulling that out from the bottom will let us take the shock out, sliding it forward. And you may have to push it up a little bit to free it, and it'll free, and then come right down and out. All right, so here's the old shock. Just laid that down here, and we'll open up the new one. Slide this out. Make sure, of course, they're the same length. And here's the hardware for it. It comes with the new bolt, a new spacer, lock washer, and nut. So just to show you here how poor these old shocks are, just pushing down on the shock to compress it, you can come all the way down, and as you see, it's not even returning. So we're going to want to make sure we set up the bolts on the bolt on the bottom exactly as it was on the old one. And to do that, we're going to pay attention to the placement of the bushing or spacer here, lock washer, and the nut. We'll take the bolt and we'll push it through that rubber center. And I'm going to turn that down so I can get these flat pieces next to the side like this. They'll be easier to grip. Then the bushing, you'll see, has a flat side and a side with a slightly raised end or lip here. That's going to go facing out, and the flat side facing to the back, just like this one. So we'll slide that on next. And then the lock washer will go on, followed by the nut. Just going to do this now just to keep the pieces together. Going to put the new shock in. We're going to only put this in finger tight on the bottom just to hold it in place, and then we're going to anchor the two at the top. So we'll slide the new shock up in front of the spring, and once we get to the hole here, we're going to push the bolt through and leave the lock washer and the nut for the other side. Once on the other side, we'll just slide the lock washer on and just tighten the nut by hand. Here we are looking up from below at the top of the shock, and you'll see that's where we're going to line up the top of the shock here. Now I've put the two bolts in, the new bolts that we got with the regular washers on top. Push them down through each of the holes, and then we'll take the shock absorber here and I'll pull it down a little bit, compress it, and then slide it around forward, line it up on those two holes, and then just coax it through as it expands, just like that. exactly into place where we want it to go. Okay, that's the mount. Now we're going to reattach the two nuts to here by hand. Now I've got the nuts on and I just hand tighten them in place right here. And now we'll take the wrenches and tighten these down. And from the shop manual for the Chevy, we've got torque settings for the shock absorber. The upper nut, which we're going to be using, so we're not using the super lift shocks. The upper nut is going to be 12 foot-pounds or 16 Newton meters. We'll set the torque wrench for that for the upper nuts. In case I forget to say, I'll mention for the lower nut, we'll do that last. That's going to be 87 Newton meters or 62 foot-pounds. All right, so I've taken my socket and extenders all the way up to the front of the two, or in this case the back, the easier of the two upper mounts. And I'm going to reach up and on the top with a 1/2-inch crescent wrench attached to that uppermost bolt. And once this is finger tight here, top and bottom, then I'm going to take the torque wrench and we'll tighten it down the rest of the way. I have the wrench on top with my left hand and the extenders and the torque wrench on the bottom. And we're going to tighten this down until it clicks. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's in. Now to attach the lower nut for the shock absorber, we're going to change the torque wrench setting to 62 foot-pounds or 87 Newton meters. Okay, so we have the torque wrench set on the nut with an extender so that I can clear the bottom mounting bracket. In the back, I've got the adjustable wrench gripping the two flat sides of the head of that bolt. And we're going to tighten this down now. Okay, so there it's clicked. We know we're at 62, and that's reattached. Now that we have the shock mounted on the top and the bottom, we're going to release the pressure on the floor jack to let the axle come down. And we're just letting it down slowly. We've shown how to put the new shock in here on the left side and do the same thing on the other side. It's just a little bit difficult on the right rear because you have to negotiate the exhaust coming up and over like that. But this is the basics. I hope it helped. Thanks very much for watching.